intro. The one thing too is like the idea is that it's not that the whole podcast episode will be the whole episode with video will be up on the YouTube channel. The whole audio, it goes out everywhere.
Okay.
And then the idea is YouTube shorts from some of the snippets.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by the One for the Week newsletter. One for the Week delivers high impact communication resources to inboxes every week that you can immediately apply to take your communication skills to the next level. Want one piece of information, or sorry, one piece. This is a new intro that I have not done before. One piece of communication and persuasion insight you can put to use right away to get your voice heard, or to more effectively lead your team, or to advance your organization's priorities. Just go to One for the Week. Just join the 800 subscribers of the One for the Week newsletter by going to whensciencespeaks.com/one for the week. That's whensciencespeaks.com/ONETHEWEEK, One for the Week. I am so pleased to have Dr. Ashley Ruba on the show today. Ashley is a UX researcher at Meta Reality Labs, building the next generation of AR and VR technology. Prior to joining, Ashley spent over a decade in academic research, studying how young children learn about emotions. She earned her PhD and master's in developmental psychology from University of Washington and bachelor's from Duke University. Welcome to the show, Ashley. It's so wonderful to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Sure. And so we're going to start out by just asking, I'm going to ask you just so generally how you sort of got started in your scientific career, where you grew up and how you first got interested in science.
Yeah, I grew up in North Carolina and I was interested in science pretty early. I really thought I was going to be an astronaut. That was the career I thought I was going to have as a
Mhm.
child. Was very inspired by Sally Ride in particular. And so I was definitely interested in science for sure, but then I got interested in psychology at some point when I was in high school. I had a friend who unfortunately died by suicide when I was 16, and I really wanted to become a therapist. And so I knew that in order to be a therapist, I was really interested in pursuing a PhD and knew that I needed to have research experience. And I ended up, when I was at Duke for undergrad, ended up joining a infant development lab. And then from there, I realized that I was actually really, really interested in research. And by the end of undergrad, after being in that lab for 3 years, I decided that what I really wanted to pursue for my PhD was developmental psychology. So that's how I ended up moving into developmental psychology specifically.
Yeah, really interesting topic. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that backstory too. Growing up, I think about, when I was growing up, and if I had, certain teachers like Mr. O'Brien for modern European history and political theory at Framingham North High School back in the day, had a huge impact on me and the path that I chose. And I'm wondering if you had maybe mentors, teachers, or others along the way who encouraged or nurtured your early interest.
Yeah, definitely. By the time I was an undergrad, I think that was the first time I had like a science mentor. And my undergraduate advisor, Makiba Wilborn, she's also a first generation college student. And so she was the person who was really mentoring me, kind of pushing me to pursue a research career. And I think just kind of created this space where I felt comfortable, like being at Duke. Our lab was really diverse, in terms of just diverse in terms of the lab members, gender, race, socioeconomic status, and being at a pretty wealthy private school like Duke, it definitely felt like, I think she used to call our lab, it was kind of like the UN, like how diverse it was compared to the general student body at
Mm-hmm.
Duke. And it definitely felt like a safe and fun place to be, at this otherwise like very, very wealthy university.
Yeah. Yeah. I also want to ask you, you mentioned you're a first generation college student. And I have to say, like, after 200 plus episodes of When Science Speaks, my operating hypothesis is that first gen scientists tend to be highly skilled science communicators. And as a first gen scientist that you are, I would love for you to comment. You don't have to agree with that. I'd love for you just to share your reaction.
Oh, I definitely agree. I think that, when I go back home and I'm talking to my parents about what I do, there's definitely it's definitely a lot of practice having to communicate to. I'm the only scientist in my family, the only scientist and only PhD in my entire extended family. So there's a lot of communication where I have to explain, like, what do I do on a day-to-day basis in a way that other people can understand. And I think that, like, talking to people who are not PhDs and who are not academics has really helped me improve my scientific communication. And one of my best friends is also first gen PhD chemical engineering, only scientist, only chemical engineer in his family, and he is one of the best, like, science communicators I've ever met, and will explain very, very complicated concepts in chemical engineering in a way that, like, I can understand, and also his entire family can understand. And it's really impressive. So I would definitely agree with that statement for sure.
That is so cool. Let me ask you this, thinking back, like, when you were going through school, when you were in high school, and maybe you were taking science courses or other courses that your parents didn't have any exposure to. Like, my older boy is taking calculus now, and I took calculus, but like he's talking about concepts that I don't even have like a cognitive like foothold in what he's saying.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I'll ask him like to explain to me, and he really likes that because I think he learns better also by breaking it down, and he can kind of test his own mastery. So thinking maybe about like as you were growing up, and maybe like did some of the practice start then? Because you were like in my case, like he's taking classes in high school and explaining them to me.
Yeah, I imagine that it did. I was pretty school motivated growing up, pretty self-sufficient, and yeah, I definitely had this experience of, like, at some point I was just kind of beyond what my parents were able to help me with
Mhm.
school-wise. And so yeah, it was a lot of, like, self-directed work at that point, to kind of learn these things for myself. And I definitely struggled moving into Duke. Like, my first year at Duke was really, really hard for me. I took calculus, I did not do well. I took a physics class, I did not do well. And I think it was just really struggling with, this jump between, like, a high school curriculum and a college curriculum, which I think, like, as a first gen college student, I just wasn't prepared in the way that, some of my peers were, who had been to, private school, like, throughout their whole life.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, those are really demanding classes, of
Yeah.
course, for anyone, but I completely understand what you're saying. I very studiously avoided math and science when I got to college. But your research, I want to talk about your research because your research is fascinating. How humans communicate, your focus on young children. Can you share with us details about your PhD and your postdoc research?
Yeah, so the broad topic of kind of, like, all of my academic research was how young children learn about other people's emotions. And so I studied this mostly with infants, so 10, 14, 18-month-olds, and then moved a little bit into preschool age kids at the end of my postdoc. But we just don't really know. We know a lot about how children learn language, for example, which is also this very complicated communicative system where any typically developing child picks up language within a few months of life. And then after, you go from this baby that, like, can't verbally communicate with other people, and then by the time you're 2 or 3, like, you can actually start to have conversations with someone. And this is all through just observing language in your everyday life. And so I was interested as to whether emotions were learned in a similar or a different way to language, because emotions are obviously this very complicated system. But it seems like young children, we figure out, like, what does it mean when someone is smiling, what does it mean when someone is frowning, what emotion do those correspond with, and how do we respond and regulate our behavior. So that was the general gist of all of the work that I did when I was in academic research, was just trying to figure out, how are young kids learning about other people's emotions and making meaning from these emotional cues that they're observing in their everyday lives.
Yeah, I mean, as you pointed out, it's very complicated and we're not really sure, perhaps, and science is always evolving, of course. Any like highlights or hypotheses or, like I don't know, finding sometimes like too strong a word, but
Yeah.
themes maybe that emerge from your work? Because I know that listeners, well, personally, I'm really interested in anything about that, and I'm sure listeners are too.
Yeah, so the predominant thinking for a really long time was that humans are born with maybe some conceptual understanding of different basic emotions like happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust. Either that or they like pick these things up really quickly because it's thought that some people argue that, when you're happy, you smile, and when you smile, you're feeling happy. And there's like a very clear mapping between, what we do with our face and how whatever internal state we have.
Mhm.
But then in recent years, there had been thinking kind of in the opposite direction where, you know, young kids like don't understand any of these like really like fine grained emotions. And instead, maybe they just understand that people feel negative or people feel positive, but it's not until they actually are learning language and labels like happiness and sadness and anger that they actually start to make more fine grained distinctions between
Mm.
these feelings. And so my work was exploring, what happens when we actually look at babies who, they can't talk yet, so they don't have emotion language. What does it seem like they understand about other people's emotions before they're actually learning labels to identify other people's emotions?
Mm.
And it seems like at least like the preliminary work that I had, it was showing that young kids seem to be able to pick up on different instances in which people might be smiling or frowning, and they are starting to make meaning from these cues. Whether or not a 10-month-old looks at someone smiling and thinks like that person is happy, I don't know. And I imagine they don't because they don't actually have that word in their vocabulary.
Mhm.
But it seems like babies, much like they pick up language really quickly, they're picking up other people's emotions really quickly. And based on, what how their parents are displaying different emotions and what kind of emotions babies are seeing in their everyday life, they're starting to make meaning from these cues that are really rich with social information.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, just thinking about it as a non-scientist would think like the ability to do that from a maybe evolutionary standpoint way back in the mists of time would be very important, to
Oh,
be
for
able to
sure. Yeah.
interpret someone's emotions like that. Um, you also served as a writing tutor, and good writing is hard to find
It
everywhere.
is.
um, I'm, I love, I've done a lot of writing and a lot of teaching about writing. And can you share, I'd love for you, your perspective on sort of what common writing challenges your students encounter, and how did you help them address them, and maybe overcome them even?
Yeah, I think I worked with a lot of undergraduates. When I was in grad school, it was with other psychology undergraduates, and when I was an undergrad, it was with undergrads from a variety of different areas. But we're just not taught, or like a lot of students aren't taught how to write that well when they're in high school, or if anything, they're taught like, this is how we write like a 5 paragraph essay, like a very SAT kind of prep thing, and there are just these like rules that get really ingrained in people's heads. And I think it's hard when we're trying to teach, scientific writing, which is not the kind of writing that's like super flowery. Or I, I will talk to students who they were told like vary your language so it doesn't sound boring. But in scientific writing, like it's not supposed to be super interesting necessarily. It's supposed to be skimmable. And so I'm like, well, no, like let's not use synonyms for like every different concept. Like just use the same word over and over
Mhm.
again. Like it's going to sound boring and that's okay. And also just getting people used to like this is how you write a paper that's longer than 5 paragraphs. Like this is how you integrate sources. This is how you paraphrase sources as opposed to just I think paraphrasing is another skill that's really hard. So when I was in grad school, I spent a lot of time trying to just educate like psychology undergrads on how to write a scientific paper because it was just so different than anything they'd experienced when they were in high school.
Yeah, really true. And like you were saying, is a skill set and a toolbox of that for that. You've also written extensively about your professional transition from academia to industry, and quickly attracted a really large and growing following on social media. For listeners who may be thinking about leaving academia, first of all, they should follow Ashley Ruba. They should follow you, and we'll have your information and links in the show notes, because you have a lot of really important things to say that are resonating and making an impact across the world. But for listeners maybe thinking about leaving academia, either maybe during their program or after graduating, what sorts of advice can you share about how to navigate the logistical issues and also the emotional issues?
Yeah, it was definitely a very difficult decision that I made. So I decided to leave. I was for for over 10 years, like throughout my PhD and through most of my postdoc, was really, I'm going to be a tenure track faculty member, R1, top 20 university in the US. Like that was really what I was aiming for. And by like all accounts, I did all of the things that I needed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And for a variety of reasons, the pandemic in particular like really decimated the academic job market, and all of a sudden it was 2022. I was in my third year of my postdoc, and I was like, am I going to keep doing this? Like, how long am I going to keep doing this? And I decided that I didn't. There were just a variety of reasons where I just didn't like want to keep trying to get a tenure track job.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also just really eating away at my like mental health.
Mm-hmm.
I struggle with anxiety, and it was just not, it wasn't really working for me as a career anymore. So out of a variety of reasons and like kind of necessity for my own health, I decided to leave and pivot into a different career. But it was definitely felt a lot of grief because I had built this research program. I'd won all these awards. I'd published all these papers. Like everyone, when I told people I was leaving, everyone was just like completely shocked.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of comments like, we thought you would be the one who, like in our cohort, we thought you'd be the one who would make it. Like you seemed like you were definitely going to make it. And so yeah, I definitely felt like a lot of like I was abandoning this thing that I had been working on for so long and was
Mm-hmm.
like building. And I was like, if like no one else is going to want to like explore these ideas in science, like we'll just never know, because I was like one of the only people like exploring this topic, which is, an interesting thing to think about. Like, is it worth exploring a topic if like no one else is actually interested in exploring it? But I think there was a lot of fear too. I was like really afraid of telling my advisors. Fortunately, everyone was, I think they're disappointed, but they're ultimately like, you've clearly made up your mind. Like, let us know if you need anything. But they weren't actually able to provide any support because all they knew was academia. And so I had to do a lot of work on my own to figure out, what do I even want to do? Like, how do I even apply for jobs? I found Beyond the Professoria is a resource that I use quite a lot, and they have a
Mm-hmm.
really great podcast that I recommend to everyone. And basically, any advice that I have for applying to jobs is in that podcast. So I learned a lot from them. Um, and then, kind of over the course of the few months of applying for jobs and talking about these things mostly on Twitter, I ended up running into other PhDs who were making the same career transition at the same time. And there really seemed to be like some momentum in this moment where, before people weren't really publicly talking about, at least like in my experience, it didn't seem like many people were publicly talking about their transitions out of academia. It seemed like people would just very sadly leave and then kind of disappear. But then we like really started just like talking publicly about it and sharing resources, and the response has just been completely unbelievable to me. Just like how many people have thanked me for just like talking about leaving, like not even like sharing advice, just like normalizing this thing that a lot of PhDs do and have to do, because there aren't enough faculty jobs for everyone. At the end of the day, there's way more PhDs than faculty jobs, and that's just a numbers game. And like it's just the state of the academic job market, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot of people have like a lot of really hard feelings about leaving. They were not supported by their graduate programs. They have no professional development training in how to make this career transition, and I think a lot of people just feel really lost.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, it to me, and I don't as a non-academic, but I don't underestimate the emotional aspect of this because of the power of identity. This was your identity for so long. And then it's like you're shifting out of that, or it's part of your self identity, I should say. And now you're shifting out of that and you're not really sure what's going to come next. Like, what are you going to be next professionally? And that can really be, so unsettling for folks who are in, jobs long term, particularly ones that are like all encompassing, like an academic job. For me, it was politics, right? I mean, it's an all encompassing kind of work. And then if I'm not doing politics, like, who am I? What am I doing? And that can be really unsettling.
Oh yeah. No, I think the identity crisis is really real. Especially, yeah, because like you said, you just poured so much of your life into this thing. And I mean, I really did not like overworking or working, more than 40 hours a week. So I didn't. But I can imagine, especially if you've just, you've made so many sacrifices for this thing. Like I moved from Seattle to Wisconsin, where I didn't know anybody for my postdoc, moved away from all of my friends, like made this like very big sacrifice for my career. And then ultimately I moved back to Seattle because I was like, I really like I miss it here. I want to be here. I want to be with my friends. But yeah, I've heard the identity crisis a lot where, especially when you've made just like work so much a part of your life, it's like, well, what hobbies do I have? Like what do I do for fun now? What do I like
Right.
doing outside of work? And it's like I'm enjoying like figuring that out now because I don't feel like I gave it like a ton of thought necessarily.
When you didn't have time for it before.
Yeah, or just not that I didn't even have time for it, but I didn't have like the mental space for it. Like at the
Hmm.
end of the day, I would just be so exhausted that I wouldn't want to like I wouldn't be working, but I like wouldn't want to do anything else because I had just been working so much during the day. Um, but but yeah, it's I mean, I'm someone who like I don't want to make work my entire life. Like I really like I liked academia, I like my current job, but I also really like spending time with my friends and going out and dancing and, just exploring Seattle and all these other things.
Well, let's talk about your current job.
Yeah.
You like I mentioned in the intro, you're a UX researcher at Meta, and like what's it all about? What I guess maybe one thing I'm really curious about is sort of what aspects of the environment have you found are reminiscent of academia, and like what's really different. I think you've talked about this a bit, in your posts, but for folks who are kind of thinking like, what is it like over there? When I was in politics, it was like you're going to leave and work in the private sector.
Yeah.
It's like like this big like Death Star, huge monolith thing.
Oh yeah.
But it's much more nuanced and complicated than that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And this was actually, so this is my second job, my second UXR job. I had another job for about 4 months before I ended up moving into Meta.
Mhm.
And so those jobs were quite different. But I feel like my current job at Meta, like I'm in Reality Labs, which used to be Oculus, and then Meta purchased Oculus, and now it's Reality Labs. But I'm actually in the R&D side of Reality Labs, which feels very academic in a lot of ways because we're doing, I guess I'm not doing this research, but there are engineers and designers who are doing really fundamental research on technology, trying to build new augmented reality systems, new virtual reality systems. And as a user researcher, I'm collaborating with these engineers and these designers to take these really early prototypes of things that are still at least 5 years out from being a consumer product and actually testing them with people to see, what are things that people might want or need in a product that's very high tech, like very in the future. Like we don't really have anything like this right now. I mean, we have VR systems right now, but in terms of augmented reality,
Mhm.
especially augmented reality glasses, which is what I've done a lot of work on. I mean, those don't really exist right now. And if you remember Google Glass from
Right, I do.
yes. So we're trying to avoid a Google Glass situation because that was obviously like a really big failure of a product, at least for a consumer product.
Mhm.
And so yeah, we're really trying to figure out. I do a lot of work on social acceptability of new technology, and yeah, just really trying to figure out like how we can build these things that are easy to use and are useful.
Mhm, mhm. Very cool. You also were selected by AAAS as the inaugural representative psychologist with non-academic careers, which was created to help professional development for non-academic careers at the national and international levels. What can you tell us about your activities in the role and how this whole thing came to be at AAAS?
Yeah, so the whole thing came about from me posting on Twitter, which is very funny. But yeah, I got an email one day from the person who was, I believe it was the outgoing chair of the psychology section.
Mhm.
And she was like, we have this new role. The role has actually been added to every single section of AAAS. So it's not just psychology, but there's all 24 sections, like all the areas of science, as a non-academic rep now as of last month. And so she's like, we wanted to fill this role. Like, I've seen your work on Twitter, and we think you'd be like a really great fit. Like, do you want to be like our first representative? Like, we don't really know what this role is going to look like
Mhm.
yet. And I was like, yeah, this sounds great. And so yeah, I've been in this role for a month, but the and I think because it is a new role, there's a lot of like freedom potentially to develop this in a way that like I see fit and the other non-academic reps see fit. But it seems like like the 24 of us will be meeting and then collaboratively can kind of figure out, what can we do to improve science and like science education and training? Because at least from, more informal polling and like talking that I've done to PhD students, it seems like PhD like graduate training just does not prepare you at all for like
Mhm.
applying to non-academic jobs. Like departments, I think now, like I've been invited to give talks and to serve on panels in like graduate departments, but this has been a very new development. So I think departments are finally realizing that there's a need for this kind of professional development, but I think a lot of professors, some of them just like don't know how to help and want to help. And then unfortunately, some professors and departments are actively fighting any PhD students from going into a non-academic career, which is really unfortunate. But I do feel like it's kind of shifting a bit to where departments and faculty are like they do want to support their students, like they do want to provide these resources. They just don't really know how. And so to the extent that we can develop any kind of recommendations for graduate departments and like, these are trainings or these are things that you should try to do professionally to help your students. That's what I'd like to do is to just try to like fix this at a departmental level, because right now I feel like in the work that I've done on social media, I'm just trying to put a band-aid on a problem that was created by just poor professional development and PhD programs.
Yeah. Yeah. This is something I focused on, when I started, in 2018, actually at the AAAS conference is sort of how it all started. But yeah, trying to, like you say, there are just not the opportunities for those who want to go on a tenure track. And even if you aren't interested in that, like the training just being really focused as if everyone is going to pursue that. So it's a big wide world out there, and you need skills beyond just ones that, on how to get your research published, for example, in a journal, or the other types of very academic focused, specialty focused uh career skills. So I'm really glad you're on the beat. That's so important. um Let me ask you this as we wrap up. Like, we're in February 2023, and beginning, first quarter of the year, and thinking about your own goals, whether they're, personal goals or professional goals. Any thoughts about that for this year?
Yeah, so I'm currently a contractor at Meta, and so one of my goals ideally is I would love to be full time. If not, I love working here. I love my current team. So if I'm not able to convert to full time here, being able to move somewhere else in Reality Labs for a full time role or potentially another company. I'm currently in Seattle, so that's a big professional goal I have this
Mhm.
year. But of course, with all the tech layoffs and a lot of the tech layoffs, unfortunately, being for UX researchers, I am mindful that it is not a great time right now to be moving around in the tech space. So I'm adjusting my expectations, but as someone who's been on, contracts or like kind of more precarious employment for a while, having a full-time job with all of the benefits and all of that sounds really, really nice. And so
Yes.
that's definitely like my big professional goal for this year. And if not this year, then hopefully next year for sure.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and then other than that, like I think personally, I just like recently moved back to Seattle a few months ago. So in many ways, I'm still, kind of getting my bearings here. I've been really focused on trying to, build out my social network here and make friends and like deepen connections with friends that I have, because as someone who has struggled with social anxiety for most of my life, that's been something that I haven't prioritized, because especially as an academic, you can just pour yourself into work and not have to deal with making friends.
Right, right.
So I think like trying to like really get a handle on my anxiety and trying to like go out and meet people and let my guard down more. Like that's something that I'm really trying to work on this year for sure too.
So inspiring. Thank you for that, Ashley, because so many of us deal with things like that. And it's really fantastic for you to talk about that. I know it's encouraging for a lot of people who are thinking the same as they're in their corner of the lab or the library and,
Oh
but still wanting to get out there too, but trying to figure out how to do it.
yeah.
Dr. Ashley Ruba, this has been a wonderful conversation. And thank you for the work that you're doing now. I'm just talking about across the social channels, what I know is bringing comfort and insight and some humor to thousands of people all over the place, and that's just wonderful. So thank you for that and for your your current work.
Oh well, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. This is a lot of fun.
And listeners, thanks for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.